Good morning or afternoon or good night, good evening to those around the world. This is the second day of the 2020 International eConference on Religion and the Holocaust. I'm Dr. Darren Slade. I'm president of the Global Center for Religious Research. I want to say thank you for attending this conference with us. What's fantastic about today's conference is that you didn't even have to get out of bed if you didn't want to. And you certainly didn't have to buy a hotel room to attend this. In fact, you're in attendance with scholars and students and academics from every continent around the world, attending here, listening to the same research, listening to the updated scholarship on Holocaust studies and religion. So thank you for being with us today. Now, I want to say I have a distinct privilege of introducing our guest speaker today, our keynote speaker, Dr. David Kyle Johnson, one of the foremost award-winning philosophers of religion in the world. Allow me to share my screen so I can introduce him properly. So Dr. David Kyle Johnson will be talking about free will, the Holocaust, and the problem of evil today. Now, Dr. Johnson is an associate professor of philosophy at King's College in Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania. He has his PhD in philosophy from the University of Oklahoma, and he's the winner of the coveted Kenneth Merrill Graduate Teaching Award. He's been published in numerous academic articles and books dealing with problems with human freedom, the problem of natural evil, the multiverse, the existence of souls, and many other philosophy-related topics. And he's also a prolific publisher on pop culture and philosophy. In fact, I'd like to highlight one book in particular. It's one of his most recent publications is the book Black Mirror and Philosophy. Now, Black Mirror is a science fiction show that's akin to the Twilight Zone. You can actually see it on Netflix. It's a fantastic show that deals with ethical and philosophical scenarios and quandaries through the use of technology and future dystopian type of scenarios. What Dr. Johnson's book does is it compiles essays from a number of philosophers from around the world that dissect individual episodes and explore some of the themes and the philosophical questions and dives in to a lot of the motifs, the tropes that how philosophy relates to today's world. The second thing I want to highlight is Dr. Johnson's work with the company, The Great Courses. And I want to highlight my favorite production that he's done. It's called Sci-Fi Science Fiction as Philosophy. Now, this one has over a dozen episodes where Dr. Johnson will explore certain science fiction movies or science fiction themes or science fiction television shows. And he talks about what is some of the philosophical questions that each show or each episode is talking about and relates that to today's world as well. If you get a chance, go to The Great Courses and purchase a copy of this. I promise you won't be disappointed. It's one of the most amazing things you can watch. And with that, I want to turn it over to my friend Kyle. Take it over, sir.
All right, thanks, Darren. Couple small corrections there. I am no longer an associate. I was promoted a couple of years ago to full professor. I've tried my damnedest to try to get the places that still say I'm an associate offline, but they still hang around.
Well, congratulations. Sorry about that. Thank you.
No big deal at all. No big deal at all. And Sci-Fi is 24 lectures. It is a very fun journey through science fiction if you want it to be. It's sitting right there as a... what I've done is something a little bit different than the presentations yesterday. I gave this presentation to myself about a month ago. So I have this paper, of course, and I have created a PowerPoint for it, and I'm going to read the paper to you with the PowerPoint that will explain everything and lay out the entire argument. But I already recorded it and did it a month ago. So what I'm going to do is share my screen in a moment, and you will see me in a different suit presenting my paper. And then once it's done, I will unshare my screen, and I will be back in this form, and we will go over the Q&A. I think it's a better way to do it. I was able to do it a couple times, make sure it's just right, and it does exactly what I want it to do, and I know how long it'll take and that kind of stuff. And so without further ado, I'm going to show that video, and then I will see you back here after it is done. Free Will, the Holocaust, and the Problem of Evil. This paper was presented first for the 2020 Global Center for Religious Research International Conference on Religion and the Holocaust. I am Professor David Kyle Johnson. I'm a professor of philosophy at King's College in Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania. If you would like a copy of this paper to follow along as I present it, it is available for free at the link below. The paper also comes with helpful comments in the margins to show you exactly where we are on the PowerPoint. Free Will, the Holocaust, and the Problem of Evil. This picture here is a still shot from a documentary, and that is a quote in German that I will not pretend to be able to pronounce. But this German quote, when translated, is, "If there is a God, he will have to beg my forgiveness." And this quote appears in a documentary, the still that we see here, about the Mauthausen concentration camp. It was supposedly written by an unknown prisoner there on the wall during the Holocaust. Now, because the walls have long since been painted over, the veracity of this claim is difficult to verify, but there's really no real reason to doubt it. The events of the Holocaust have long raised questions about God's existence and why, if he exists, God would allow such suffering. So it's not hard to imagine that a prisoner in one of Hitler's concentration camps, in the throes of despair, would have etched such a thing on the wall of their prison cell. Now, this quote is far from a clearly articulated argument with a specific conclusion. But once we realize that conditional if-then statements like this can be translated into disjunctive either-or statements, the potential conclusions the prisoner might have had in mind become clear. So translated, the quote becomes this: either God doesn't exist, or he will have to beg my forgiveness. If we add the assumption that God certainly exists, then the conclusion becomes that God will have to beg the prisoner for forgiveness. And from there, it is a short step to the conclusion that God is morally imperfect. And any divine being that has done something to apologize for, by definition, cannot be morally perfect. So we could symbolize it like this and read it as, either God doesn't exist, or he will have to beg for my forgiveness. God does exist, therefore, if he will have to beg for my forgiveness, then he is morally imperfect, thus God is morally imperfect. Indeed, one might even argue that a moral imperfection that allows God to permit the Holocaust makes God downright evil. If, however, we add the assumption that God is by definition morally perfect and thus cannot do anything deserving of an apology, then the prisoner's statement becomes a part of an argument that God doesn't exist. Here we could symbolize it as such and read it as, either God doesn't exist, or he will have to beg my forgiveness. If God exists, he is morally perfect, and if he is morally perfect, he cannot ever have to beg for my forgiveness, thus God does not exist. Now, it's entirely possible that the prisoner didn't know which assumption to make, and thus which conclusion to draw, or maybe he didn't have an argument specifically in mind at all. But it is the latter argument that is more interesting. After all, anyone can tweak their definition of God after the evidence has already come in so that they can continue to say that God exists. It is another thing entirely to reject God's existence altogether. Indeed, the latter argument is essentially a version of the problem of evil, the classic argument which suggests that God must not exist because evil does. And what I would like to explore here is whether the evil of the Holocaust can be used as a reason to justifiably conclude that God does not exist. So, the problem of evil in the Holocaust. A basic version of the problem of evil is simple enough to state. If God existed, evil would not. Evil does exist, therefore God does not, from 1 and 2. The argument is valid by modus tollens. So the question of the argument's soundness turns on the truth of its premises. Now, some have tried to deny premise 2 is true by suggesting that evil does not exist. For example, inspired by Augustine, one might claim that evil doesn't exist per se, but is merely a privation of good, in the same way that black is an absence of color. But not even Augustine endorsed this idea as a solution to the problem of evil, even if evil is merely a privation of good, which is itself debatable. It would still not be clear how God would allow the privation of good. In other words, in response to this solution, one need merely clarify the argument to suggest that if God did exist, there would be no privation of good, and certainly no privations as grand as the Holocaust. And from this, the argument's conclusion would still follow. Those known as skeptical theists might also deny premise 2, or at least that we can know that premise 2 is true. Since God's knowledge is beyond us, they would argue, and we cannot see all ends, for all we know, the things we think are evil will ultimately work out for the good. And thus, for all we know, evil doesn't exist at all. This, in essence, is an academically sophisticated version of God that works in mysterious ways. But this answer also falls short. I have refuted skeptical theism in a different context elsewhere, showing that its probabilistic calculations are erroneous. But the objection most relevant here is that it leads to moral agnosticism. It makes moral knowledge impossible. If I cannot know that something as horrific and consequential as the Holocaust is in fact evil, because, well, for all you know, 6 million murdered Jews might actually turn out to be a good thing, well, then I cannot know anything, at least in regard to truth. Indeed, in regard to moral truth. Indeed, inspired by the failures. Okay, all right. So, indeed, inspired by the failures of both of these objections, we can build into the original argument a kind of separate argument for the truth of premise 2 that uses the Holocaust as evidence. If God existed, evil would not. The Holocaust occurred, and if the Holocaust occurred, then evil exists, right? And this is where we take the skeptical theism, say, well, for all we know, for all we know, it actually could turn out to be good. If I can't know the Holocaust is evil, I can't know anything morally. And so I know that if the Holocaust occurred, evil existed. So it follows from that evil does exist. And then from there, we can conclude that God does not exist. Let us call this the problem of the Holocaust. Because premise 2 here is not only obviously true, but denying it would require us to either deny 1 star that the Holocaust occurred, or 2 star that the Holocaust was evil. Premise 2 is firmly established. The more common response to this kind of argument, therefore, is to deny premise 1, to suggest that for some reason, even if God did exist, evil would still occur. One possible way to defend this idea is to suggest that God is not perfect. Either God lacks the power to prevent evil, the knowledge to know how, or the will to do so. But, needless to say, in Western philosophy, where the assumption that God is perfect in every way is firmly entrenched, this is not a popular option. What's more, as I suggested before, this solution is uninteresting. Anyone can tweak their conception of God after the evidence is already in to avoid having to give up their belief. In my logic class, I teach my students that this is called making up an ad hoc excuse and that it is irrational. What's more, those who embrace this idea are not really talking about what everyone else thinks of or is talking about when they say God. So the more popular option is to explain how or why, even if God is perfect, he could still allow evil to occur. Now, this solution might work, But in order to understand such explanations and whether they can solve the problem of the Holocaust, it will be necessary to articulate 4 different varieties of the problem of evil and figure out which one or ones the problem of the Holocaust falls under. So let's talk about varieties of the problem of evil. The kind of problem that the problem of evil presents is usually thought of in 2 ways. It's either a logical problem or it's an evidential problem. If it's a logical problem, it suggests that there is a logical incompatibility between the existence of God and the existence of evil. God and evil cannot coexist any more than a triangle can have 4 sides. Evil is deductive proof that there is no God. If it is an evidential problem, however, then the occurrence of evil is evidence that presents a sufficient reason to doubt that God exists. It does not deductively prove that God does not exist, but it does render belief in God irrational. Such versions usually add the words probably or most certainly to the conclusion. But since evil is also thought to come in 2 different varieties, moral and natural, the problem of evil is often divided along these lines as well. If the evil mentioned is the result of a human action, then the argument is expressing the problem of moral evil. But if the evil mentioned is the result of some kind of natural event, like an earthquake, not caused by human action, then the argument is expressing the problem of natural evil. So we can divide the varieties of the problem of evil as such. So we see our logical and evidential. You're right. Sorry, pointing the right way, pointing the wrong way. There we go. Right down there, right. We see our diagram here, right, where we have things divided by logical, evidential, moral, and natural. And so those are kind of the 4 varieties of the problem of evil. Now, I have argued elsewhere that satisfactory answers to neither the logical nor the evidential problems of natural evil have ever been expressed. When properly articulated, the logical problem of natural evil suggests that a perfect being would never embed physical laws into the very fabric of the universe that makes things like diseases, hurricanes, and earthquakes inevitable. The kind of analogy I often use is if I was as a master of my dogs, I would not be considered good if I embedded little puppy killing machines into the walls of my house that randomly kill puppies, right? That would obviously be wrong. But it seems that what God has done is has built those kinds of things, earthquakes and tornadoes and that kind of stuff, into the very fabric of the universe by he embeds physical laws in the universe that make those kinds of things inevitable. So the evidential version suggests that every such natural disaster, like the Indian Ocean tsunami of 2004, is evidence against the idea that our universe was created by a perfect being. Short of the uninteresting ad hoc suggestion that God is imperfect, or the more interesting but controversial suggestion that he didn't actually design our universe because, like, we live in a computer simulation, there is no forthcoming answer to these problems, either the logical problem of natural evil or the evidential problem of natural evil. But because the Holocaust was orchestrated and carried out by humans, it would appear that the seriousness of the problem of natural evil is irrelevant to our purposes here. The problem of the Holocaust would seem to be a version of the moral problem of evil. And it would also seem to come in both varieties, the natural and evidential varieties. The logical and evidential problem. They have logical and evidential versions of the problem. So a logical version of the argument would suggest that the occurrence of the Holocaust is deductive proof that God does not exist. The evidential version would suggest that the Holocaust renders belief in God irrational. Consequently, it will be useful to look at the ways that theists have responded to the logical and evidential problems to see if they can get us out of the logical and evidential problems of the Holocaust. So let's talk about free will. The most common solution to both of these problems invoke what is known as the free will defense, which was most famously articulated by Augustine. In essence, it suggests that premise 1 is false. Even if God existed, evil could still exist because there is something God rightly wants more than the elimination of evil, but which logically requires evil to exist. And that thing, of course, is free will. And why is free will so important? Because only with it can good exist. As Augustine explained, if man is good, and if he would not be able to act rightly except by willing to do so, he ought to have free will, because without it, he would not be able to act rightly. In other words, only free acts are good acts, morally good acts. To do moral good, you must freely choose to do good over evil. Thus, in order for there to be good in the world, we must have free will. Of course, with that free will, we will occasionally choose to do evil, but that is the price that is worth paying. The existence of evil is something God is willing to permit in order to make morally good actions possible. Now, despite all of this, one might still ask, why can't God ensure that everyone chooses or never chooses evil? Why can't he ensure that everyone never chooses evil? If God is all powerful, couldn't God create a world in which everyone always freely chooses to do the good? To begin to address this, let's look at how a modern philosopher, Alvin Plantinga, applies free will as a solution to the logical problem of moral evil. So solving a logical problem. Our exploration of Alvin Plantinga's solution should begin with the obvious. As he rightly points out, God can't create a world where everyone always freely chooses to do the good by forcing everyone in that world to always choose to do the good, because by forcing them, he inevitably makes their choice unfree. There can't be a world where everyone is forced to freely choose to do the good. You can't force free actions. Still, one might wonder, why can't God create a world in which everyone always freely chooses to do the good on their own without being forced? Couldn't God, for example, choose to populate a world with all and only people he knew would always freely choose to do the good? Well, according to Plantinga, when God creates, he actualizes a possible world. Now, Plantinga admits that because he is perfect, God must actualize the best possible world he can, the best actualizable world. But it's possible, Plantinga argues, that because of free will, no matter what possible world God actualized, if it has free creatures, there will always be evil in it. In other words, Plantinga says, it is possible that all actualizable worlds with moral good will also have moral evil. Now, the reason Plantinga thinks this is because he thinks it's possible that all possible morally free creatures suffer from what he calls trans-world depravity. No matter what world you put these people in, they will eventually do evil. He says it's possible that all people are like that. If so, it is not possible for God to actualize a world with moral good but no evil. But since a world with both good and evil is better than one with neither, or better than no world at all, it is not contrary to God's perfection to actualize such a world. And thus, we have a logically possible scenario in which God and moral evil coexist, and the logical problem of moral evil is supposedly solved. But there are two things wrong with Plantinga's solution. First, it's not clear that it is coherent. Plantinga claims that it's possible that the set of all actualizable worlds does not contain one with moral good but no evil. But in doing so, Plantinga is invoking possible world semantics, which express possibility in terms of what occurs in some possible world. On possible world semantics, X is possible if X occurs or is true in some possible world. That's just what X is possible means. But there is no actualizable world with good but no evil. So that phrase, there is no actualizable world with good but no evil, that is not something that can occur or be true in any one possible world. That is something that would be true of the set or a subset of all possible worlds, not in any one particular world. And something very similar is true of Plantinga's claim that it's possible that all possible beings suffer from trans-world depravity. That's not something that can be true in one possible world either. on face, it doesn't seem to make sense to talk about different possible ways the set or the subset of all possible worlds might have been. To deal with this, or how it might be even, right? So to deal with this, one might invent a kind of meta possible world semantics that refers to different possible ways the entire set or subset of logically possible worlds could have been. We might denote this as something like possible M, put a little subscript M after the word possible, and say something like, some configuration X of all possible worlds is possible M if there is a meta possible world Y in which X takes that configuration. On this approach, God and evil can coexist because it's possible M that the set of all possible worlds contains no actualizable worlds with moral good but not evil. And it's possible M that all morally free beings suffer from transworld depravity. But it's not clear that this suggestion makes any sense. There is no alternate way the set of all possible worlds and any subset it contains could be or could have been. This set is defined and restricted by what is logically consistent. And something similar is true of the set of all morally free beings. Because the set is infinite and complex, granted, we cannot know exactly what that set is like, so we can imagine or suppose that it is or its subsets are one way but not another. I can, for example, imagine that it contains actualizable worlds with good but no evil, and Plantinga can imagine that it doesn't, but that in no way demonstrates logical possibility. Indeed, in order to solve the logical problem, one must demonstrate that it is logically possible for God and evil to coexist, that there is such a logically possible world. Imagining different ways a subset of all logically possible worlds might be does not accomplish this. The second problem with planning a solution is that it's not clear that it works to solve the logical version of the problem of the Holocaust. That argument would essentially suggest that there is no logically possible world in which God and the Holocaust coexist. In order to solve this, planning a solution cannot just show us that it's possible M, that there are not actualizable worlds with good but not evil. If that's true, God must still actualize the best possible of those worlds. Planning a solution, therefore, is committed to the suggestion that our world, which contains the occurrence of the Holocaust,